Good morning. Today we're nearing the end of our sermon series on through the minor prophets, and we're looking at the second half of the book of Zechariah. Why did I do this over 2 weeks? This one's a challenge. Major learning from the minors. The first part that we looked at, the first 8 chapters, was that God has a plan. And the plan is He's going to be God, and He wants us to not take His position. He's God, we are not. Let Him lead, let Him take over. He's in control. That's the way that life is supposed to be. He is God, we are His people. We obey what He says, and life is better for everyone. That's the plan. And we have this because it's the second generation, well, several generations from those that went into captivity. Now, it's the first generation that's come back to Jerusalem, and they have a chance to restart. And so He reminds them, this is the plan. I will be God, you are not. And so that's kind of a summary of what we did through the first 8 chapters. The second part that I see is there's a thirst also within us for a God that leads us. Not only does God have a plan, but He doesn't just kind of leave us out there to wonder and think about what this plan is. He explains the plan. He says, I will lead you. And so God is knowable. He is a guide for us. So we're going to be taking a look at 9 through 14, chapters 9 through 14. And I'm going to bring up some of the points that you might want to make as you go through. In our guest Bibles, we're going to be starting at page 1479 in the blue guest Bibles as they're there in front of you. It's our second week in the book of Zechariah. It's not an easy book to understand or apply. So I was looking back at the sermons. Mark Copeland, which is where I got the background information for the sermon series, and he makes this statement. The last 6 chapters of Zechariah have been described as some of the most difficult in the Bible. Okay. I was coming to you for a little guidance through this. But he also says, what's the difficulty? Well, the difficulty lies in discerning the true fulfillment of these prophecies. Not only their initial fulfillment, but whether there's a double fulfillment and where this goes and how this is ultimately revealed. Because we have a number of visions and we have a number of statements, prophecies that are in here as well. But even the apostles were unable to fully discern the Old Testament. Remember that? When you look through the New Testament and the apostles are looking through the Scripture and they're trying to figure out what it means. But the Lord helped them. In Luke chapter 24, 44 through 47, explains how He made the Old Testament understandable to them, how the Scriptures became understandable. And I think God helps us in the same way. Well, thanks for the help, Mark, but maybe it's not as difficult as what it seems at first. We ended chapter 8, verse 23 with this interesting image, this vision. It's a pretty amazing picture because it says, if you follow what I want, if you live the way that I want, and I am God and you follow me, then here's my hope, my expectation. This is where the plan goes. The plan is this picture. He says, in those days, 10 men from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, let us go with you because we have heard that God is with you. The idea that because we have a relationship with God, that it would be so attractive to the world around us that people would come to us and say, show us this God. Could you please explain God to us? Could you please help us in our relationship with God? That's kind of been God's plan. Does it always work? Not because God doesn't want it to work. But we also have to live our lives in a way that shows that we're obedient to God, both by His grace and His mercy, but by living our lives in relationship with people around us. God has a plan for His people to be led by Him and to worship in ways that draw the world towards us, because our God is not only a consuming fire, but He is an awesome God. And the best use of that word, not just the cultural use, but that God is far above any of us. And because He is God, our lives are about bringing Him honor and glory. And we enjoy the days that He gives us. and he is the center of it. God is worthy of worship. Both Haggai and Zechariah, the last two books that we've looked at, remind us that our God is a God worthy of worship. When? All day, every day, and together on Sundays. He wants to be our God, and we need to be his people. Worship binds those truths together. That truth that God is God, and we are his people. That's when these come together. When we realize that, and when we express that, it becomes a part of our lifestyle. It is a privilege to be in the presence of a holy God, is it not? To not only be in his presence, but to be in his presence because he has invited us here. Because he says, hey, I want to spend time with you. It could become cowering. It could be crawling. It could become with very repentant hearts, thinking that he's just going to wipe us out. But he calls us in to say, I know who you are and what you've done and how you live, but I love you. Come spend time with me. God invites us to worship. And he expects us to be there. Because he expects that we're living that type of a life. That's not the only theme in Zechariah. So what's a second theme? A second question that was presented in the first 8 chapters is, it was presented by those who returned to Jerusalem from Babylonian captivity. It relates to how is God going to deal with those who persecuted his people? Remember 70 years ago when we went into captivity? How are you going to deal with these people that sent us there? How are you going to deal with people that did not honor you and do not worship you and still don't? How are you going to handle them? It's a theme of righteous judgment. But it's also a theme of leadership. How is God going to lead his people, and how is he going to demonstrate his character through all of this? It's that righteous judgment, a leader of righteous judgment, that's a thread that I see through the last chapters. The challenge comes because of the time frame. Some of this refers to a future, some to a near immediate future, and depending on who you ask or what commentaries you look at, some expect it to be way in the future. So that's what makes this book of particular challenge. Here's my premise with all of that. If it's a prophecy to a people, it had to have at least an immediate, understandable, significant connection. Does that make sense? God didn't write any scripture to people that they didn't have at least some connection to. So we're going to try to connect to how they understood it rather than say, well, where did this go from there and from there and from there? Because that we don't necessarily know. But the better we understand the people in the time and how God is speaking to them, the better we can say, well, it's likely they saw it this way or they connected to it with this background. People are thirsting for God. That's been our premise through the summer. It's kind of the premise of what we do, is that people really are looking for God and they may not realize it. But they're thirsting for a God who is worthy of worship and who leads us. Who doesn't just lead us out there and make us guess, but that he actually does provide a gentle hand of leadership while respecting our decisions as well. We're going to see his leadership in these chapters, but realize we're coming to the end of the Old Testament in the chronology of it. The Old Testament is coming to a conclusion. At the end of the book of Malachi, the last one written, our next week's sermon, there's 400 years of silence where God spoke to no prophet. That's what's coming. What comes after the 400 years of silence is the Messiah. Jesus comes. So these are the last books that give us this glimpse that God is going to silence the prophets, but that the Messiah is coming. And they start to fill in their minds, and those messages pass on and on and on as they now think that God himself is going to send a deliverer. God himself may yet come in the flesh. So the passages about the Messiah become even more relevant in these last two books, because they're the last ones written before we have 400 years of silence. Kind of the last voice that echoes that's passed on and on and on. We're going to notice some things from Zechariah chapter 9, page 1479. If you look at how the very first verse is, It says, the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach. And then I summarized the chapter. And. So the word of the Lord is against who? All of these people. All of these people. The judgment is against Syria and Philistia, the two major nations that are around Jerusalem. These are the enemies that have been around Jerusalem in their time of judgment. Their time of judgment is now come, and God will deal with these people. He's reminded them that I have not forgotten, and that I know how to deal with people that do not worship me. So in Zechariah chapter 9 and 10, it tells us about a God who leads us. The passage is likely familiar to you. We have the promise of the king, the character of the king, and the nature of the kingdom, all wrapped up in this one little statement. God says, I will deal with them, but I will deal with them according to my character. So what's the character of this king? Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 says, Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. Now what he says next is going to be relevant. The king comes to you. The king comes to you with a sword blazing. What does he say? What's the type of king that is now going to pronounce this righteous judgment? Your king comes to you righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. He will rule and extend from sea to sea, from the river and to the ends of the earth. When you're thinking of a God of righteous judgment, that's not necessarily the passage. Here comes our king riding on a little donkey. Woohoo! Not necessarily the image I would have come up with. But why those character traits? Do you remember where this is applied? This is Palm Sunday. Jesus comes into town riding on a donkey. And they say, that's that passage. But God knows, it still reveals his character, who he is and how he lives. The righteous king, the king who leads us, he's going to be gentle. And his kingdom will be peaceful, but it'll also be universal. It'll go to all nations and all ends of the earth. Matthew chapter 21, 1 through 7 says this is fulfilled on Palm Sunday. They'd been waiting for this event. They literally thought he was going to come riding on a donkey. And guess what? He did. Why isn't this an allegory or metaphor? But it was a specific fulfillment of this passage. The chapter ends focusing on God saving his people and delivering them from the enemies. That's verses 11 through 13, and then leads them to victory and glory. And that's verses 14 through 17. It ends up that there will be victory, but it's led by this Savior riding a donkey. In chapter 10, it shows that the Lord will care for Judah and Israel, and that Israel will be restored. Remember, that's a big theme, because they're now at home and they're rebuilding the temple. And God says, well, I'm going to take care of the whole land. I have a plan, but I will also protect you. I will lead you through this. But he explains that there's going to be some changes. They need to turn from idols, and God will give them new shepherds. He said, the shepherds that you've had are not good for you. He redeems them, he restores them, and he brings them back from far lands so that they can walk in his name. That's what we read in chapter 10, verse 12. But he expects them. You can't follow me, and I can't lead you if you're going to follow other things. So you have to get the idols out of the way. And then I can take care of your leadership and give you proper leadership. So we get to chapter 11. It contains imagery of judgment as well as the reminder of how they have become separated from God in exile. I'm going to read this chapter. I'm going to present it as a historical reminder. This is one of the chapters that there's all kinds of opinion about what he's talking about. I find it most challenging when people apply this to the second coming of Jesus, when there hasn't been a first coming. So I have a little disconnect there. when you jump over the coming of the Messiah and say this return, this is about the second coming, the end of time completely. It doesn't make sense to me. They wouldn't have understood that at all. But it does make sense to me if it's a historical reminder. It's kind of an interesting chapter with the images. It's an image of judgment as well as a reminder. How did we get into this? How did we go into this 70 years of captivity? And farther back, the northern tribes, when they were lost, how did that happen? Remember, this is generations past the first people that did this. So in this, we have the shepherd with two staffs. And depending on which translation you use, the NIV uses these two words, which they make sense to me. He says he has the staff of favor and he has the staff of union. Judgment comes from the north, he says in chapter 11, 1 through 3, which made sense because the north was taken first. The people are compared to sheep, which were not protected by their shepherd. So God steps in and says, I'll be your shepherd. In verse 7, he leads them with a staff of favor and union, but the sheep detest him, it says. So the staff of favor is broken. And he says that's the covenant to protect his people. If you do not want to be my people, then I will break the staff of favor and you do it yourself. And what happens? They get taken into captivity. The northern 10 tribes are just wiped right out. In this section, Zechariah chapter 11, 12, and 13, another passage that just kind of sneaks in here that you've heard before. It says, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they priced me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver, threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. That just kind of slides into this passage, but somehow the people remember it because when Judas does this, this is specifically the passage that's referred to. It's no coincidence to them that it was 30 pieces of silver. And what did he do with the 30 pieces of silver? He threw it back into the temple. And they bought a plot of land and they called it Potter's Field. They applied this passage and they brought it to fulfillment. When they read this, were they thinking of that? I don't know if they were. It doesn't read in here like it's prophecy, like God is going to make this happen. It's an announcement of what happens. When you break the staff of favor, you can get paid off. And he says that's a pretty good price to get paid off. But I don't need it. Throws it away. The passage is applied to Judas. The second staff is the staff of union. It's broken. And it says that's the bond of brotherhood between Judah and Israel. And the sheep were turned over to a foolish shepherd who does not care for the flock. To me, it's an allegory showing why they went into captivity. And if God's not going to be their God, then who's going to take care of them? Who's going to shepherd them? Well, I'll turn you over to a foolish shepherd, and you will be shepherded by the nations that take you into captivity. That's how I'm connecting to chapter 11. Then we get to chapter 12. It brings us, to me, more back to the current time frame of Zechariah as God provides a message to that generation about how God is going to protect his city and his people against future enemies. You remember how you were taken before into exile? What's going to happen in the future? Is Israel ever going to be attacked again? And God says, I will protect my city. Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. Says, they will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him. That seems to have a fulfillment of Jesus on the cross. I will protect my city, the area where I'm in control, to the point of my own pain and punishment. That was a promise that God made to the people. Finds a fulfillment in Jesus. He says during this day of salvation, when it says this day, on this day, it took me a bit. I had to read back and find it. During this day of salvation, which is when as the enemies come and attack and I protect my city where I'm in control, during this day of salvation, while the enemies are at the gate, chapter 13, verse 1 says, "On that day a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity." This also seemed to have its fulfillment in Jesus, even if we don't know how it was understood by its original audience. That when they pierce me, that it will have an impact on those that even have done that. That it will bring about a way for them to cleanse them from sin and impurity. So these thoughts keep rattling around in their mind, even through the 400 years of silence. In 13:7, it says, "Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." That's also a passage applied to Jesus. In Matthew 26:31 and Mark 14:27, the passage is quoted back here from Zechariah. There's a theme in 13:7 through 9. It's the refining nature of judgment. At the end of the process, after this judgment has taken place, even though God has protected the city, the people, the inhabitants, some have been lost. But they are refined by this process of being attacked. At the end, they will say, "They are my people, and I will be their God." They will say, "The Lord is our God." So in all of this, I see our draw towards a God who leads us, even in difficult times. That God said, "I will protect the city," doesn't mean I'm going to protect everyone in it. But that I will lead us through this. We will get through together. And it's true today that sometimes people look to God when times are tough. And that refining process gets them thinking about spiritual things. Where they say, "I will be your people if you'll please be my God." Well, if that wasn't tough enough, then we get to chapter 14. Chapter 14 is one of those that gets extra difficult. There's lots of opinions that exist. There's some imagery in here. There's the way that things are presented. You know, if you were a conspiracy theorist, you could go all kinds of places with this one. Because the passage is about the Lord comes and reigns. And so you see why people tie into that and say, when is the Lord coming and when is the Lord reigning? And they want to take this and kind of go all over with it. But it had to mean something to that first group. It gets extra difficult. Many opinions exist as to what it means, when this will happen, or when it has happened, or if the same truth comes up several times in history. Here you go. There's my 2 cents. We don't use them anymore, but I put them on there. My 2 cents at this point is that the chapter shows that Jerusalem will be attacked. You read through, he just said that he will protect it, but then he says, but it's going to get attacked. And even in the attack, God will protect it. God will again save a remnant of those that are obedient to him. Even when things look extra bleak. So if we look at this historically, when would things get extra bleak? What would be an understanding of the fulfillment of this? They've returned from Babylonian captivity, but that's not the only nation left. We've still got to get to, from the Medes and Persians to the Medes to the Romans, before that's when the time of the Messiah. Things would look extra bleak like they would when the Romans take the city. And if you want to go to the next one, when the city is destroyed in AD 70 after the New Testament's written. But it doesn't matter when you apply this in that sense, because whenever it is, whenever times are bleak, whenever it seems like you're under attack, the truth is that God will lead you. His kingdom is bigger than this. And here's the challenge in these passages. we need to understand that it wasn't just tied to the land of Israel in the city of Jerusalem. Now that comes back not from the minor prophets so much, but the major prophets. If you think back to a passage in Daniel chapter 2, 44 through 45, it's the image of a statue with these layers. But the fourth kingdom is one that is unlike the others because it's not bound by the earth. But it is bigger and it takes over everything. And I think the best explanation of that is the kingdom of God, which is not bound to any time or space or place, but it is a kingdom that is now universal and timeless, where God is in control of everything and asks us to surrender to him. The kingdom is led by the Messiah, and we are his people. So to me, it's that Daniel 2 passage talking about the empires that come and go, but yet the last one goes beyond the Roman Empire and has never existed, never ceased to exist. It's led by the Messiah, and we become his people. So even though these chapters may be difficult to understand, and I'm likely have not answered a number of the questions that you might have come up with as you've read through, but I want to draw our connection that it's to trust in a God who loves us enough to lead us. In all of that, I see the first 8 talking about God has a plan, but that God will not forget you and that God will lead you, and even though things are confusion, that God has something coming up. And if you stay with him, good times come and go, but God will protect you. You want to be part of the remnant. You want to be part of the faithful. So, if God's going to lead us, what's our application? Be better followers. That's what it makes sense to me. How do we apply this? Even though it has a lot of confusing imagery, well, what we can do is say, if God's going to lead, I can learn to follow better. So I want you to consider your spending. Eric, this is about the offering. Well, a little different. Because what do we actually spend? How do we invest in the kingdom? What is the currency? Do you know what it is? It's not just finances, it's time. Time is the thing that will end. It is finite. How we spend time shows our connection to the work of the kingdom, to our obedience to the Messiah. So the first way that we can live a passage like this out, if he's going to lead, we need to follow. So how do we do that? Well, we spend time in God's word so we know his voice and his character. So when he says, do this, we know that it's him and not somebody else. We know his voice, we listen, and we immediately obey because we're waiting for direction and we expect it. We expect God to lead us. We spend time in prayer. Well, how does that help us? It helps us to be thankful, and it helps us to ask for direction. And here's another part of that. When you ask God something, your next step is to listen. If you ask and keep talking, he probably is not going to answer. But when we ask and then listen, then God can lead us. We spend time with others who help you listen and obey. We talk about spiritual things. We talk about the confusion in our lives. Here's the decisions that I need to make. We spend time with those that think spiritually because that helps us follow God who leads us. We spend time wrestling with God if you need to. Isn't that a process in your faith? To wrestle with the big questions? If Zechariah confuses you, good. Then be confused. Then get into it. Then wrestle with it. If that's where you're at and that's where you need to be, then go ahead. It doesn't mean following's easy. But God will always lead. If you need to wrestle with God, then get in there. He's good. He'll wrestle with you. He'll let you come to your faith. He'll let you own it. But he'll also lead you through it. When you're done fighting, he's still going to be there. He's okay with that. Life can be confusing. How about this one? Spend some time preparing your heart for obedience before you approach him. That could have been number one, right? Sometimes we go in with this panic question, God lead me, God lead me. We're not really ready to listen or to obey, but if you calm yourself down and ask and, okay, whatever you say, God, I'm willing to do it your way, there's a pretty good chance you're going to be led. Spend time making the kingdom the priority. How about that? If you got those other idols up there, if you got all those other time wasters, if you get the confusions of life and say, oh, I need to check with God, and then check back with God. But if you make the kingdom the priority and that worship, that God is first, then you got one voice to listen to. What do you think about your investment? Can you spend time doing these things? Because time is finite. That's a confusing concept to us. But there comes a time when there will be no more time. Whether it's personally in our lives end, or Jesus returns, or the people that we're trying to reach out to, time ends for them. But time is a currency. And when we invest with our time, God blesses us richly.